Now that you understand type conversion, let's look at a few questions where you have a block of code and we want to find out the output for this block of code. So if you look at this block of code, the first thing that you have is a variable called a of the int data type, which is set to 5. Then we have a variable called b of the double data type, which is just set to a plus 2.0. And finally, we're printing b. This is pretty simple. If you want to evaluate this, we'll just take our second expression. Since we are printing b, we need to find out what b is. If I take b, b is equal to a plus 2.0. A is 5, so I can rewrite this as b is equal to 5 plus 2.0. Now this is an int and this is a double. I can't add a double and an int. So what Java is going to do is it's going to implicitly convert one of these things. If you remember, I told you that an integer or an int can be converted to a double because an int is smaller than a double. A double, however, can't be converted to an int. So in this case, Java is going to convert this int to a double. B will then be equal to 5 will be a double, so we can get 5.0 plus this double 2.0. B will be equal to 7.0. When I print B on my output window, I'm just going to see 7.0. To show this, I just wrote the same block of code on my code editor. I have my variable A, I have my double variable B, and I'm just printing B. When I run this program on my terminal or my output window, I'm going to see 7.0. Now let's take a look at this block of code. Here I have a variable called r of the car data type, which is set to lowercase a. I have a variable called b of the int data type, which is just set to r plus 5. And then I'm finally printing the value b. Now, you might think that this is a bit weird because how do you add a character and an integer? It doesn't make sense. However, if you remember type conversion, I told you that the car data type is lesser than an int data type and it's also lesser than a double data type. And according to this order, a car data type can be converted to an int. A car data type can also be converted to a double. So then in this case, if you have int b is equal to r plus 5, even though this is a car value, Java is going to implicitly convert this to an int and then use this. But how exactly would I convert a car value to an int? We're going to do this using ASCII values. If you already didn't know this, every character in Java, including special characters like the asterisk or the ampersand or even things like a space, have an equivalent numerical value. So here lowercase a, as you can see, has an equivalent int value 97 and lowercase b has an equivalent int value 98. These values or these equivalent int values are called our ASCII values. If you look at uppercase characters, uppercase a has an equivalent ASCII value 65. Uppercase z has the equivalent ASCII value 90. So here, if I want to evaluate this expression in b is equal to r plus 5, I'm just going to use ASCII values. So let's just rewrite the same expression. We have int b is equal to r plus 5. Since the car data type is lesser than an int, a car gets implicitly converted to an int. However, an int can't get implicitly converted to a car. So here Java is going to implicitly convert this car value lowercase a to an int. If you look at these ASCII values, the integer equivalent of lowercase a is 97. So instead of lowercase a, we can just rewrite this expression as int b is equal to 97 plus 5. 97 plus 5 is just 102. So the actual value of b is going to end up being 102. When we print the value of b on your output window, you're just going to see 102. And I just took the same block of code in my code editor again, where I have my car variable r, which is set to lowercase a. I have b, which is set to r plus 5. And then I'm just printing the variable b. When I run this program, you can see that we do get our output as 102. Next, we're going to take a look at this block of code. Here, we first have a variable called x of the double data type, which is set to 13.45. Then we have a variable called y, of the int data type, which is set to int of x plus 22. And then finally, we're just printing the value of y. Now, unlike before, we finally have explicit type conversion in this question. We're explicitly converting x to an int. Let me just rewrite this statement and see if we can evaluate the output. We have int y is equal to int of x plus 22. If you look at x is a double. Implicitly, a double cannot be converted to an int. This is not possible. However, an int can be converted to a double. This is possible. Since I'm trying to convert a double to an int in this case, I will have to use explicit type conversion. So here, when I'm using explicit type conversion with 13.45, if I want to convert this to an int, since I mentioned that explicitly, Java is just going to ignore the 0.5 and use the int value 13. So here we can just replace this int of x with 13. Now our value of y is just going to be equal to 13 plus 22, and that's just equal to 35. And when I print the value of y, I took the same expression again in my code editor, where I have our variable x of the double data type set to 13.45. I have my variable y of the int data type set to int of x plus 22, and then I'm finally just printing the variable y. When I run this program, we get our output as 35. This is exactly what we expected as well. We're going to see 35 as the output. Next, we're going to take a look at this block of code. First, we have a variable called d of the float data type, which is set to 1.5f, basically 1.5. And we have a variable called m of the int data type, which is just set to d plus 2. We're finally just printing the value of m. However, if I take the same block of code in my code editor, it's giving me an error. It's saying that there's a type mismatch and it cannot convert from float to int. If you look at this block of code, if you remember type conversion, you'll know that generally the order for type conversion is a character or a char data type is lesser than an int data type. This is lesser than a long data type, and this is lesser than a float data type, and this is finally lesser than a double data type. Implicitly, Java can convert an int to a long, an int to a float, and even an int to a double. However, it doesn't work the other way around. I can't convert a double to a long. This is just not possible. Even when I'm trying to convert a float to an int, this is not possible. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do over here. D is set to 1.5f. It's a float value. And when I'm trying to write this as int m is equal to d plus 2, Java cannot implicitly convert this float to an int. If I want to convert a float to an int, I'll have to use explicit type conversion. So here, if I want to correct this block of code, I'll just have to use explicit type conversion. Let me just rewrite the block of code. First, we have a variable d. So float d is just 1.5f. Then we have a variable m. So I have int m. And this is equal to d plus 2. Now I need to convert d explicitly to an int. So I'm just going to add int in brackets before it, and I'm just going to add 2. Then our next statement is just a println statement, which is just printing m. Now we'll try to evaluate for m. So when I have a float value 1.5 and I want to convert this to an int, what Java does is that it ignores the decimal and it just gives you the remaining as an int value. So here, if I'm trying to explicitly convert 1.5 to an int, Java is just going to remove the 0.5 and it's going to give us 1. And then finally we have the plus operator and 2. This is just going to be equal to 3. And the println statement is just going to print 3. So on my output window, I'm going to see 3 as my output. Now, after I make this change, now if I take my block of code again, but I made the change. Now, if I take my block of code again, but I add this explicit type conversion over here, when I run this program, it gives me an actual answer. It gives me 3 as the answer. This is also what we expected. Now if I take the same block of code, but I add an int before the d to explicitly convert it, now we don't get any error because I'm allowed to do explicit type conversion. I'm forcing Java to convert this float to an int. When I run this program now, we get what we expected. We get 3 as our output.